have you. So we're just beginning this sermon series on 4 different perspectives on Jesus. And we're going to look at the 4 different Gospels. And last time at the beginning of June, we talked about the political climate in which Jesus was born and what was going on in Jesus' world. And today I want to set one more foundational sermon before we look at the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke specifically. And I want to talk about the world that Jesus grew up in. Because, and this may be really shocking to you, the world Jesus grew up in was quite a bit different than our world. But also what happens is you will see there's a lot of similarities too. And so there's some things that are really different and some things that are very much the same. And to understand who Jesus was and to understand how radical his teaching was, you have to see the context and the world that he was born into and the world he grew up in. And we read for our scripture this morning that Jesus, it says, grew up in stature and in favor with God and man. Now what's interesting is that one specific scripture in Luke chapter 2 there, that's the only scripture we have saying almost anything about his childhood. And it's right after that story, remember, where he's at the temple and his parents forget him and they leave, and he's in dialogue with the Pharisees and the teachers of his day, and he's learning more, and he's asking questions as he's starting to come into his own and starting as a young man to learn about himself and his own identity and who God is and the scriptures and all those things. But other than that, we don't know a lot about Jesus' childhood. We don't know his own personal stories or things that happened to him. But we do know actually quite a bit about the world that he grew up in. And the world he grew up in was a kind of interesting time in Earth's history. We mentioned last time that the Romans were ruling a large territory all around the Mediterranean Sea. And so there was a new one-world culture kind of creeping in all over. But even within that, there was still a lot of unrest, a lot of fighting for political power. And of course, as you know, the Jews who were under Roman occupation, they were not happy about this arrangement. And they were longing for their independence. And so it won't surprise you to know that in Jesus' day, there was a lot of apocalyptic movements. That in the world that Jesus grew up in, there were zealots. In fact, it's interesting to note that in the Bible, it calls one of Jesus' disciples Simon the Zealot. Now, the term zealot could be used for a number of things, so we don't know exactly what Simon was so zealous about, but it was often a term for someone who belonged to a group that wanted to overthrow the Romans. And as time would progress, there were all these little pockets of these zealots and bandits. And sometimes they were called robbers. And they were called robbers because they hated the Romans, and they would get a group of men together and they would do guerrilla warfare. Which I thought was kind of interesting because terrorism and guerrilla warfare is still a thing today. Some 2,000 years later, it's still a primary tactic of religious zealots in the Middle East today. So while things are very different, they're still very much the same. And so these groups, and you would have some charismatic leader who would rally a group of men and put his army together. And we're told in the Bible in Acts, there was a guy who rallied 400 men together. And he was known, and of course the Romans would eventually figure out who he was and where the men were hiding. They'd often go out in the desert and kind of hide out there. And then they would go in and they'd do raids. And they would strike an encampment of Roman soldiers, and they'd steal as many weapons and things as they could, and they would kill some of the soldiers. And they would just do these little guerrilla warfares trying to undermine the Roman power. And then there was told in Acts, there was another group that had 4,000 men. So this would have been a major group that was fighting for Jewish independence and Jewish freedom and getting back at the powers that were oppressing them. And then we're told, of course, that Jesus had disciples, Simon the Zealot. And by the way, they were called robbers. It's very interesting to note. Remember this man called Barabbas in the Bible? And he was referred to as one who was part of an insurrection. And he was specifically said that he had killed someone. He was in prison for murder. So he is probably part of these groups. And he might have been the leader of one of these groups. And he specifically in John's gospel referred to as a robber, which was also code for being one of these zealots who was going and trying to weaken the Roman authority and rule. And then Jesus was crucified with two what? Robbers, thieves on either side. Now, to get to the point where you were crucified meant that you probably were in insurrection to the Roman government. So it's very likely that these two robbers, that one that hung on either side of Jesus as he was crucified, were men that were part of this apocalyptic zealous groups that would raise up from time to time, always seeking to bring in the independence and freedom that they believed the Bible prophesied. So this helps us to understand the context. So Jesus is raised in this context, and they are looking, all these apocalyptic groups are looking for the Son of David. They're looking for one in the Davidic line who would become king, throw off the power, the yoke, the oppression of the Romans, and restore Israel to glory. This is the world that Jesus was raised in. These were the teachings. And the Pharisees we talked about, and the Sadducees we talked about a little bit. The Sadducees held all the power at the temple, and the high priest came through the Sadducees. The Pharisees were the religious people. They were the ones really trying to live right. They were the ones trying to keep the law and teaching people how to keep the law. And then you had another group. I don't know if you've heard of this group, the Essenes. Have you heard of the Essenes? So the Essenes were this monastic group. And the Essenes looked around at the world of Jesus' day, and they said, you know what? The Romans have become too influential, and the Jewish faith has been completely corrupted. It's become worldly. We have some today who say that, right? It's become so worldly that we cannot recognize the pure faith, and in order to live the pure faith that God calls us to, they went out into the desert, and they separated themselves. They felt the Pharisees were even too liberal and too corrupted. And they felt, in fact, they called the Pharisees, in their writings, they referred to them as the ones who love flattery. I thought that was interesting, because we look back at the Pharisees, we kind of judge them too, because it seems like they did want that praise of men. They took the highest position at the table or in the synagogue, and they would announce with trumpets if they were giving to the poor. And so the Essenes said, man, those Pharisees, they're just doing it for show. We are actually going to live it. So they went and lived in the desert. They were monastic. And they began a tradition that would carry on even in Christianity, because early Christianity had the desert fathers. If you study Christian history in the 1st and 2nd centuries, you had these people who just go out into the desert to be with God, them and God, and to be pure. And of course, by the Dark Ages and Middle Ages, you have monasteries being formed, and nuns going off and living by themselves, and monks going off and living by themselves. And it kind of traces itself back to this Essenes group who they lived, and they lived so strict in this group. I'll give you one example. Guess how some of them kept the Sabbath? You will love this. You thought the Pharisees were bad? They would go to bed at the sundown and not get out until the sun set 24 hours later and the Sabbath was over, because the Sabbath commandment said not to work, and the only way you couldn't do any work is to lie perfectly still for 24 hours. Aren't you glad you weren't raised in Essene? You thought your parents were bad. Man. Well, the good news is they're monks, so they wouldn't have had any kids. Although we did have some evidence there were some couples. There were some married couples, but primarily they were monks who went and lived in the desert. And they had a strong, thriving community there down by the Dead Sea, but they were wiped out in AD 70 when that whole thing went down and the Romans really cracked down. And the Essenes also had a lot of apocalyptic visions and writings that they believed the Messiah was going to come, this Davidic. In fact, here's the Essenes had an interesting take. They believed two men were going to come from God, one from the line of Aaron, a new high priest. They felt the priesthood was corrupted, which it was. So they felt God was going to send some righteous teacher in the line of Aaron who would restore the priesthood to the perfection it was supposed to be. And then they felt God would send a military leader to restore the line of David, who would become the king of all of Israel and throw off the Roman yoke. So they kind of sat on the side waiting for God to send these two individuals to wrap up, and then this whole new era would be restored. But as Christ prophesied, instead of that, the Romans in AD 70 would destroy the temple, Jerusalem, and most of Judaism. And so they never saw the fulfillment of their own scriptures and writings. But we have a lot of their writings thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in the 1940s. A lot of those came from that Essene community near the Dead Sea. So this is the crazy world that Jesus was in. And I'm setting the stage because we're going to end our sermon today by looking at how Jesus' teachings were so different than what was happening. And it's fascinating to me because here in 2021, when we have academic scholars looking at the teachings of Jesus and looking at the Bible, and critical scholars saying, we don't know if Jesus actually existed. We don't know if he actually said this. We don't know if he was raised from the dead because that doesn't sound scientifically viable. And so we have all this criticism about Christianity, all this criticism about the scriptures. But one thing that becomes really fascinating when you do study the historical evidence of the world Jesus grew up in is that Jesus does not fit what somebody would make up if they were going to make up a story. If Jesus was going to be a teacher of his day, he could have picked some very convenient theologies to model his ministry after so that he could have gathered a following and been popular. He could have taken the throne. You remember his own disciples and the people of his day wanted him to declare himself king, and they were ready to go. But Jesus' teaching was so countercultural that to me it is a primary evidence he came with a divine mission, not with a human mission. He did not do what a human would normally do. Any normal person born in that era would have picked one of these philosophies and theologies and apocalyptic visions and said, I'm the one. Follow me. And we think Barabbas probably did do that, which makes that interchange so symbolic that the Jews choose Barabbas and say, crucify Jesus. We want the one who's teaching what we believe, what we think, not this other guy who's teaching us things that are offensive and countercultural, that do not say to us what we want to believe, what we want to hear. Well, let me give you just a few little tidbits about Jesus' early life and what it would have been like to be raised in that time, just to set the stage. I think some of these things are fascinating. Obviously, in this culture, it was a culture that valued males above females very strongly. In fact, this was in Roman culture as well as in Judaism. In fact, it may help you to feel a little better about this to know that the Greco-Roman culture was actually far worse. It was very common in that time period, if you gave birth to a girl and you already had a couple girls or whatever and you didn't want a girl, they would literally just set the girl outside the house to die. Just leave her in the sun. And then somebody, they said at that time, this is Greco-Roman culture, sometimes someone would come and steal the baby and raise it to be a prostitute and a slave. Isn't that horrible? So Jews would not do that. Jews would keep the girls and raise them and treat them as family and their own, but it was always the males that had the power and the authority and the inheritance, and women were treated much like property in that time. In fact, the Pharisees had debates at that time of Jesus about what you could do to divorce. Now, it's interesting, in Greco-Roman society at that time, both a man or a woman could ask for a divorce and get a divorce. But in Judaism, only the man could ask for a divorce. And some of the religious teachers would teach at that time that you could ask as a man for divorce for any reason. Specifically, you've probably heard this, if your wife burned the food, she was not a good cook, that was grounds. And the worst one was one of the teachers said, if you just find another woman who's more fair, then you could ask for divorce. Now there were, in the Judaism defense, there were some teachers who did not agree with that and said, no, only divorce for adultery. That's the only reason. And of course, you remember Jesus comes along and he says, no, the two are one. Divorce is only when there is a break in that marital relationship. And so he makes it very clear where he stands on that issue. And in so doing, by the way, he's elevating women. In fact, Jesus, throughout his ministry, would elevate women at a degree that was very abnormal for any teacher of his day. But we'll come back to that at the end. Weddings were a huge deal in Jesus' culture. In fact, it's very interesting. The first thing that we learn about Jesus is he's attending a wedding. A wedding was a 1-week ceremony. And hospitality is a huge thing in the Middle Eastern culture. And so when you, as a family, had a wedding, you had to provide, your whole family's reputation was on your hospitality at this wedding. And this would be a week-long event. It would start with the groom who would march through the village and march to his bride's house, and all his friends and people of the village would join in, and they'd be singing, there'd be music, and then they would go to the bride's house. He would knock on the bride's door, and the bride would come out with him, and they would all go in procession to the bride's house. And at the bride's house, the family would feed you for 7 days. Any dads getting worried about weddings? I think it's bad enough I have to pay for, an hour thing with a reception and all that. Imagine a 7-day feast that you were responsible for. But they took great pride. It was the whole village would come and celebrate, and they loved it. It was an excuse, and there'd be music and dancing and singing and wine and food. And as we know, it was something that even Jesus participated in because his first miracle occurs at a wedding, which apparently his mother was helping to be one of the hosts, and it was probably a family member of Jesus that was getting married, though it doesn't say specifically. But you know that story well. Now what's interesting is for Jews at that time, they would eat 2 meals a day. The first meal would be at noon, and then the next meal wouldn't be till later that evening around sunset. And they'd both be pretty big meals, as you can imagine, and eating together was an important thing, especially that evening meal. That evening meal, the whole family would be there. If you had any guests, if any relatives just happened to stop by, come on in, we're going to eat. You force them to sit and eat with you, and you enjoy it. So the evening meal is a big meal where you just come together and you share in that fellowship. Now, in Greco and Roman culture, they ate 4 meals a day. And so this was, again, a little difference between the two cultures, Judaism with 2 and the others with 4. What was also interesting is as the Roman Empire creeped into this land of Israel, then you started to have Greco-Roman cities that were built in the land of Israel. And so you had this mix of these two cultures and these mix of these two populations. And the Romans were good because they learned, as they would take over other civilizations, that they would try to preserve just enough of whatever culture they were dominating so that they would still be obedient, but they would accept the Roman rule. So the Romans would come in all these cities, and they would build their architecture and their marketplace and their amphitheater and their library or different things like that. But they would also build a synagogue for the Jews. So they would build that, and you have these references in Scripture about so-and-so helped us build our synagogue, or even Herod, of course, was known because he built the temple back in Jerusalem, which earned him a lot of points with his Jewish servants or citizens that he was over. The house that Jesus would have grown up with would have been built primarily of stone. And I think I explained this last time, but if you've ever been to Israel, there is a lot of rocks because it's arid. It's a desert country. And everywhere you go, there are tons of rocks. And guess what there's not very much of? Trees. Yeah. That's why in the Bible you hear, oh, the cedars of Lebanon. Lebanon had the forest. So Lebanon was considered wealthy because of their access simply to wood. Now in Maryland, we have no such problem. In fact, I have already cut down a few annoying trees in my own yard that are a problem. And so trees we take for granted here. But when you think about Jesus being a carpenter, it probably meant he worked primarily with stone and then some wood. There was just enough wood that they could do some things with it, and there was some furniture. And one of the ways they would use wood is they would put the walls of the house as stone, and then they would get a few wood pillars to lay across the top, and then they would take reeds and palm branches and mud and cake the top of the roof. And their house was always 2-story, by the way. So they would build up the walls 2-story high. They would make a floor, again, out of a few posts or beams, then lay all this mud and palm branches, whatever they could find, to make a floor, and they'd do the same thing for the roof. And then the animals would sleep, or the animals would be kept in the first floor at night. During the day, they let whatever animals you had. Now, obviously, if you're wealthy, you have more, you have a bigger house, and you have more room for the animals. If you're poor, as Jesus probably wasn't too wealthy, you would have had the animals underneath, and then the top floor is where you slept. And everyone slept in the same room. It was one room. They had a mat they would put down. The father would sleep at one end, the wife, and then the children. And this makes more sense when you think about the story. Remember, Jesus told this parable where somebody's knocking on the door saying, hey, give me bread, but it's late at night. And the guy says, oh, come on, I just went to bed. And he's saying, I just went to bed. I don't want to go all the way downstairs to the door. I don't want to step over all my children. Like once everybody's in bed, they're in bed. It's hard because they're just crowded together in the same room. And so getting up is not like we have our own room for the adults and the kids and everybody today. And so you remember he says, please don't make me get out of bed and come on down there to the door. They had one door and they had very small windows. And they were worried about thievery, and there were always bandits and thieves, so they made the windows too small to get in. But you had one door that they could bolt and make it very secure at night. They didn't want anybody stealing their animals from them. And, by the way, scholars agree, and you may not have heard this, scholars agree that when it says Jesus was born in a stable, that the actual word is not stable, but actually a home. And it's interesting that when the wise men show up, it says they visited Jesus in a home, which is probably more accurate. And what they're saying is every home was filled on the top floor because people would host their relatives, all of Bethlehem. Nobody had any room on their floors, so the only room was the bottom floor where the animals stayed. That's the, quote, stable. So many scholars believe this is most likely what happened. So Jesus and his parents were on the bottom floor. They probably had a little raised, there's usually like a raised area where you could go, and then a dirt area for the animals, and there would have been a manger there, as we know, to feed the animals at night. So he's born at night. They got nowhere to put him, so they have to put him in the manger. They get some clean hay and just make the most of somebody's bottom floor because that's the only room available in Bethlehem. And so likely Jesus grew up in Nazareth in this kind of stone house with these kind of thatched roofs. Now, the other thing you need to know about this roof is that when it got really hot in the hottest part of the summer, a lot of times they would sleep on the roof because the heat would get trapped in this little house with the roof. And so they had a ladder on the outside of the house that would go up to the roof. Now, you remember a time when this roof came into play in Jesus' ministry, right? He's teaching in a house. It was probably someone's that was a little wealthier, big enough that a lot of people could get in. He's teaching people. He probably would have been on that second floor, which we don't think about, but it would have been on the second floor filled with people. The hospitality, again, somebody welcomed Jesus in their home and welcomed as many people as they could fit. And then there was no way for the paralytic to get to Jesus. The house is crammed. But there's a ladder on the outside, so they go up on the roof and, as you know, start digging through, which they could have done because it would have been kind of this mud and palm branches. And of course, it would have been annoying to the homeowner to have their roof destroyed, but it wouldn't be impossible to repair. And we'd like to think maybe that those 4 guys that dug the hole in the roof maybe went back later and fixed it up for them, because it was all common kind of materials that were used to make this roof. And so this is part of the world. And as was the tradition, fathers would teach their sons their trade. So what are you going to be when you grow up? Look at your father, you know your answer. If you're a son, you don't get to choose. You don't go to college and pick your major. Your dad's a carpenter, you're a carpenter. Your dad's a whatever, you're a that. Fathers train their sons. Boys did get some education in the synagogue. They were taught, some Hebrew and Aramaic and some of the scripture. The synagogue became the community center. So Jesus would have been there not only on Sabbaths, but during the week. There were other events that would happen. The synagogue also sometimes was where business deals were ratified, and it just served a lot of purposes in the Jewish culture. The social values of the day, you have to understand this is an Eastern culture, and as is still true to this day, Eastern cultures thought very much in the mindset of we versus I. American culture is very individualistic, Western culture in general. But Eastern culture is very much we, and so they thought in terms of their family, not in terms of me. You thought of honoring your family, not pursuing your own honor. And by the way, if you failed in something, the whole family failed. It brought shame to the whole family. It's an honor culture. And we're going to come back to that as we look at one thing that Jesus taught. Family was very important. The father, of course, is the head of the family. You got your status and identity based on your family. That was your family name was everything. And so the members of your family. By the way, there was also a larger extension. Your village was also part of your reputation. And so the village took a lot of pride. And if somebody in the village was bringing shame, they bring shame to the whole village. And so probably when you hear them say, Jesus from Nazareth, can anything good come of Nazareth? Clearly some people had ruined the reputation of Nazareth. And so there was a shame about the whole village because of some of the things that had apparently taken place in that village. So if you have your Bibles, let's go to Luke chapter 15. And I just picked an example. There were so many you could have picked from, but I wanted to look at this story, this parable that Jesus told. It's one you're very familiar with, but now I want you to hear it in the context of the world that Jesus grew up in. And I hope it hits you as we read through this story how countercultural this story is, how radical was the teaching of Jesus. Because everywhere we turn, Jesus is teaching the truth of God above the cultural norms, above what would have been the normal understanding and beliefs of the people of his time. And it's no wonder that the Pharisees and teachers thought he was a threat to Judaism as a whole. So in Luke chapter 15, we have 3 parables, but we're going to look at the parable of the lost son, or as we often say, the prodigal son. And Jesus says in verse 11, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." Already Jesus has their attention. Patriarchal society. The father of the home has all the power. He is to be respected above all else. And what is interesting is Jesus says it's the younger son. Now the older son has a little bit of clout, the firstborn. He's going to get a bigger part of the inheritance. He's going to take the father's position. He's the one that's going to be the next one to be in charge of the family and the family name. But Jesus says there's this man. He has 2 sons, and the younger one has the audacity to come to him and say basically, "I wish you were dead." That's what it means to ask for his inheritance before his father has died. Normally, that would be given to him at the father's death. He's saying, I want it now. Now, we might say, oh, well, let's see how this story goes, because I can imagine this son is going to get it. To come and be that rude in this culture, this is about the most offensive thing you could do. This is a great way to disgrace your family. To tell your father, I want my inheritance and I want to get out of here. Not long after that, the Bible continues, or Jesus continues in this story. Oh, I'm sorry. At the end of verse 12, it says, so he divided his property. He gave him his part, his share. Now, I'm sure he's got his listeners' attention right there. No father of that culture and that day and age would ever even think of doing that request. And not long after that, he says, the younger son got together all he had, took the money that he got from his dad, set off for a distant country. Now, a distant country means he's no longer in Israel, right? He's left Israel. Now he's gone to some Greco-Roman culture, this heathen pagan culture that does not have the morality and values that the Jews cherished and valued. So he's leaving. He says, not only is he saying, I don't want you, Dad. I don't want your religion. I don't want your values. I'm going off and I'm going to start a whole new life without you. In my way. So he set off for that distant country, and there he says he squandered all his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself to a citizen of that country, who sent him to feed his pigs. You think Jesus is making this story uncomfortable? He doesn't stop. He has made this as offensive as he can. A good Jew would get nowhere near a pig. In fact, there's this great line. You remember I told you about Herod, the first Herod, and the one who built the temple, and how he ended up killing several of his own sons and his mother-in-law and one of his wives just because he was suspicious. They were plotting against him. Well, Caesar heard about this, and knowing that Herod also tried to pretend he was a Jew, though technically he was from a country south of Israel, but he always presented himself to Jews. I'm a Jew, I'm one of you. So Herod would not touch pigs. Herod would not eat pig, which to Caesar seemed weird because pig is the best meat, you know? So Caesar made this great quote, and you can look it up. This is a true quote. Caesar said, it's better to be one of Herod's pigs than his son. Like you got a better chance of staying alive as a pig around Herod than to be his child. So that's what Caesar thought of Herod. And it would be very true. Because I don't think Herod ever killed a pig, but he did kill members of his family. So for a Jew to feed pigs shows he has gone as far from his upbringing as he possibly can. And here's this young man who has squandered all this money. He's down to the point where it says in verse 14, he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. In other words, this young man has fallen as far from his faith as you can fall. And he finds himself in this position, even being jealous of the food the pigs are eating. And when he came to his senses, it says in verse 17, the young man said to himself, how many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men. I think that's a beautiful words that he puts in the son's mouth. That the son, he says specifically, came to his senses and he said, wait a minute, what am I doing? and he sees that he has sinned against God, or against heaven, as it says, and against his Father. And I don't want to dismiss this point because we all know how this story is going to end. We've heard it before. But one thing we don't often realize is the true repentance that we see in the Son. It's not like he said, you know what, this didn't work out. I'm going to go see what I can get out of Dad again. He doesn't say that. He literally looks in the mirror and he says, man, I have sinned. I have sinned against God. I have sinned against my Father. What have I done? And that's what Jesus calls coming to your senses. Coming to your senses. What am I doing? How did I end up here? And I just want to call that to your attention before we get to the ending, because I don't know what your life is at this moment. I don't know where you're at. I don't know where you're at with God. But there may be someone here today who came because there's this burning conviction. I got to change. I got to do something. I don't know how I ended up here. I've drifted a long way from where I should be. And the good news is, when this young man goes home, you'll never believe how he's received. It says he set out to go see his father, and that's in verse 20. And as he made his journey, and remember, he's coming to ask his father, first of all, to say, I'm sorry. And second of all, to say, could you just hire me? I just need a job. I just need to survive. And maybe you'll have compassion on me. And I love that the son knew enough about his dad to think he might have compassion. That's pretty radical too, because in that culture, that wouldn't have been the norm. You dishonor the family, you're out. You want to live apart from us, then go. But don't you ever come back. That would have been the norm in the culture. You bring shame and dishonor to us, fine. Go do it, but you're cut off. We no longer identify with you. You are out. And that is still practiced in some Eastern cultures, by the way, today. But not in this story. In this story, in verse 20, Jesus says, while he was still a long way off, his Father saw him. Now, how in the world would the Father have seen him a long way off? Only if he was looking for him. The implication is that every day the Father went out and looked down that long driveway to see if today was the day. What kind of Father is this? And Jesus takes it up a notch. Not only did he see him a long way off, but the minute he sees him, what does he do? Something no head of the family would ever do. In that culture, to run, especially as a dignified leader, of someone of importance, would never run, because the only reason you would be running would show that there's somebody more important or something more important than you that you need to run to. But when you're important, you walk and other people can come to you. In fact, sometimes you don't even move. You just stand there and wait for them to come to you because you have the status. But Jesus says the Father sees him a long way off and runs to meet him, runs toward him. The listeners of this parable must have just thought, what a scandalous thing this guy is teaching. Not only that, when he got there, he threw his arms around him and kissed him. Every convention, every bit of dignity, everything that would have said, I am a father and man of integrity and of honor, this father casts aside, races out to meet him, throws his arms around him, and begins kissing this son who has disgraced the entire family. The son gave his speech then in verse 21. He says, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe, put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost, but now he is found. And they began to celebrate. There is nothing in Judaism. There is nothing in any of the zealous groups, the apocalyptic literature, the Essenes, any Sadducee teaching, Pharisee teaching. There is nothing in all of Jesus' culture that would have suggested he should teach something like this. The only reason Jesus tells this parable is I believe he came from his Father, who he knew was a God of great compassion and grace and mercy. And he says, brothers and sisters, I want you to know the true God. Because what you've heard about this God is not the accurate picture. I want to tell you who he really is. And he is so radical. He's like a father whose son spits in his face and leaves, and he still runs out to meet him, wraps his arm around him. By the way, when he puts the ring on his finger, he's welcoming him back into the family. It's the family signet ring. That was his access to anything that the father had access to, including loans and money and prestige. He could take that ring and get whatever he needed. He is brought back into status in the family like nothing ever happened. So it's no wonder that Jesus says the older brother is a bit troubled when all of this takes place. And the older brother, you remember, comes and says, Father, what are you doing? And he refuses to go and celebrate. By the way, the celebration implies, as it would have in that day, that he invites the whole village and says, come on, everybody, we're killing the fatted calf. It's a celebration. My son was lost and now is found. So the older brother, of course, sticking with the culture of the time, has a huge issue with what this father has done and what the son has done and why we're celebrating. What is there to celebrate? And the father says something interesting to the son. Verse 31, my son, you, the older brother, you are always with me. Everything I have is yours. But we have to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found. In other words, this is something to celebrate. It's not what he's done to disgrace us. It's that he's come to his senses and knows what he needs now. It's not about his past. It's about his future. It's not about the shame. It's about the fact that now he has come and wants to be part of the family. That's worth celebrating. That's the kind of radical Father in heaven that we have. And by the way, that says a lot about how we are to view others. And you notice the Father, I just have to point this out as we close. The Father says, your brother. You see, you've forgotten something. He's your brother too. You should care too. Why am I the only one that felt bad that he was lost, that he was dead, that he couldn't find his way, that he was making all these bad choices? Why am I the only one that wanted to see him restored, redeemed? And I think God looks at his church today and he says, do you care about the people I care about? These people out here that are using drugs, that are politicians and lying, that are trying to climb the corporate ladder, that are offensive, that are cutting you off in traffic, that are whatever was bothering you, these people that are on the other side of the political aisle, these people that are not heterosexual but they're homosexual, these people that are the wrong skin color, these people that are on the wrong side of this issue, they're your brother too. And even if you think they're lost, shouldn't you have some compassion for them? And if they walk through our doors, shouldn't we run and embrace them? Even if they're different. Because at least they're coming. At least they want something different. At least they're looking for something more. Maybe they've come to their senses. We should celebrate that and rejoice. And I don't think the young son had figured everything out by the moment he fell at his father's feet, but it was the beginning. And the father said, at least he's come to the beginning. At least he wants to make a new start. At least he's come to his senses, as Jesus says in the parable. And so when I look at the world Jesus grew up in, and I look at the Jesus that taught, and what he taught in relation to the culture he was raised in, I see a divine teacher. Someone who came with a message not from his culture, a message not from the people that taught him, a message not from other apocalyptic groups, but a message from God himself. As Jesus always said, I have come from above so that I can teach you the truth about my Father. And my Father loves you. And even if you've squandered it, even if you brought dishonor, even if you've done things that you think I could never forgive, your Father longs to forgive you. Your Father longs to give you a new start, a new beginning. He longs to just put everything in the past and say, don't worry about that, my child. Just come home. My arms are open, wide open. So as we close this morning, I want to challenge you. Maybe you haven't done anything quite so radical, but one thing I know living in this world, we all carry a sense of guilt. We all carry a sense of shame. We all know that we're not quite good enough. And we all have, I think, these tapes in our brain that just kind of go on repeat cycle that say, you know, you're not quite good enough. You haven't quite done enough. You need to be better. I don't know if God can really accept me because I don't know that I measure up. And I want to tell you, those are tapes from the world, but they're not the tapes of God. It's not how he thinks. He's that Father that's just looking down the driveway. Just come, just make the first step, and I will race out to meet you. I will run most of the way to get to you because I love you that much. Come back to the family. You can start over today. You can walk out of this sanctuary and start completely over. And I don't know about you, but even as a pastor, I need to restart. I need every day just to, okay, God, let's reset everything. And you and I, we got to do it better today. I need your forgiveness. I need your love. I need your grace. I need your acceptance. And he'll put that robe around you. He'll put those sandals on your feet and that ring on your finger and say, welcome home. You're part of the family now. I want to be part of his family, don't you? I'm going to invite